Hey, and welcome to this PowerPoint presentation on MLA Citation, which is lots of fun. I'm Professor Holly Johnson, and let's get through it. Okay, what's MLA Citation? How do you get it? Is it contagious? Basically, MLA Citation is just a system that we use in scholarly essay writing in all of college that tells where material came from if it was from someone besides yourself. So that's just letting people know where you got your info from, and that actually letting people know that you got your info from other good sources makes your writing look stronger. The purpose is to avoid plagiarism and give credit to other people for their. What does MLA mean? Are there other styles? It stands for Modern Language Association, and it's a group of language professors and other professionals who study how we use language, and they came up with this crazy system called MLA. And there are other types. There's APA, which stands for the American Psychological Association, which you will be using in your psychology classes and other social sciences. And then are they very different? No, they're not that very different. Basically, they all do roughly the same thing. But APA uses footnotes, which we don't use in MLA, or endnotes, and different types of citations. So they're just a little bit different. Okay, there are two components of MLA citation: in-text citations and a works cited list. Back when you were in high school, works cited might have been called a bibliography, but it's the same thing. It's a list of all of the things that you used from outside sources. Okay? In text, works cited, in text, works cited. Let's go. So, if I asked you on a quiz or an exam or a final exam, what are the two components? I'm sure you would say in-text citation and a works cited list. All right, so now we need to think about what each of these two things are. Let's talk about in-text citations first. As you're writing along in your essay, each time you're going to refer to other material that came from somewhere else, you let us know where it came from, and you give it in one of three forms: a block quote, a short quote, or a paraphrase. Okay. All right. So let's go to the next slide and figure out what each of those is. So short quotes are about 3 lines long or so. Okay. You put quotation marks around it, and you follow it with the page number in parentheses. Okay. Block quotes are going to be a little bit longer. They're going to be 4 to maybe 8 lines. Please do not have block quotes that are like entire pages that you yanked out of somewhere else. Block quotes, you still need to pick out the actual most useful part. So the block quote needs to be one idea taken from some other author, about 4 to 8 lines long. Okay? When you do a block quote, you don't actually put quotation marks around it, but you drop down to a new line in your text, and then you single space, right, that one section, and you indent the whole thing, and then you put the page number at the end in parentheses, just like the short quote. Okay? So the block quotes look a little different on the page. You can see them stand right out when you look at the page. Paraphrases are occasionally useful to make sense of what the author's saying if you put it into your own words, but you have to correctly convey what the original idea was. Okay? And you set it up letting me know this came from somewhere else, but it's still in your words, and then you put the page number. So I should be able to see the page number for all the different kinds: short quote, block quote, paraphrase. All right, let's go to the next slide. There's a procedure every time you give a quote, no matter which type it is. First, before you even get the quote, you set it up, telling me who said it, what the publication was that they said it in. If you're writing the research paper, you need to explain why that person or publication is a legit source, not biased and scholarly. And then what the context is. Well, what were they talking about when they gave this quote? Then you give the quote itself. All right. Short quote, block quote, paraphrase, whichever form, with the page number in parentheses afterwards. And then you explain in 3 or 4 sentences afterwards, at least a sentence, but usually more than one, how that quote relates to your thesis. So why are you using this quote? You had an argument you're trying to make in this paper. How does this quote, work towards that? All right, here's an example. Here's a short quote with an in-text citation. In the article Global Warming's Fast Approach from the Journal of Science, Millard Anderson, a professor of meteorology at the University of Virginia, writes, The impact of global warming is already evident. Many people have already died from storms that would not have been so deadly if not for global warming's effect. We usually think of global warming as something that will just make us uncomfortable, but Anderson shows precisely how dangerous the phenomenon really is by explaining how it links to fatalities. Let's go to the next slide. So in this slide, you can see I've broken it down. We've got all the different pieces. The purple part there at the beginning is the setup where we find out the author's name and where it was published and why this person is being quoted, what the context was. All right. Then in black is the actual quote itself. You can see it's a short quote. It's got quotation marks around it. It's only 2 lines long, roughly. And it's got the page number there in parentheses. We made it red. Obviously, in your paper, you don't need to use all the colors, but I wanted to break it down for you so you can see what we're talking about. And then in the green section here, this is the part where they're discussing why they're using this quote, what's valuable about this quote for their argument. And usually right after a quote, if you look at those lines right afterwards, you should be able to get an idea of what this paper is about and what this person's actually arguing. This paper is clearly about how dangerous global warming is, right? And this is a one source that it's using to get to that point. All right, let's look at another example. Next, let's look at a block quote. Okay, here's a block quote within text citation. Let's just read it together. In the book DNA Unraveled, author Maria Stone, a forensics expert from the Crime Lab of Philadelphia, explains how DNA can be used to exonerate falsely convicted criminals. She writes, in many cases that occurred in the 1970s and earlier, before DNA testing was available, falsely accused criminals and are now proving their innocence by having DNA samples examined. For example, a man who was accused of a rape and convicted based on circumstantial evidence, like matching a description and being in the right location, can now ask for the evidence boxes to be unsealed so that semen or saliva-stained garments from the victim can be tested. DNA does not go bad over time if the evidence was collected properly. Stone goes on to clarify that DNA evidence is not a solution in every case. However, the kind of case she mentions mirrors Waylon Marquette's case exactly. Marquette is sitting on death row in Arkansas, but the ability to prove his innocence exists. All right, so this is a block quote. Let's go to the next slide and look at it with a breakdown. All right, here are the components. We can see them again. The purple part here at the top is the author's name, the publication, and a little bit about why that author is valid and what they were talking about, right? We have to set up the quote. Then we've got the black section here is the actual quote itself, and you can see there's no quotation marks around it, okay? But it's single-spaced, it's indented, so it's off by itself, so you can tell right away it's a different part of the text. You don't need the quotation marks to make this clear, okay? Then at the end, we've got the page number, just like before, okay? And underneath, in these green sentences, we see why this is relevant to the person's argument. And what's interesting here is that actually, if we read those green sentences, what we realize is that this paper really wasn't about DNA evidence. It's about the specific guy, Waylon Marquette, and something about how he could be exonerated, okay? And it's just using this quote from this person to say this kind of evidence can be valuable in this other situation. All right, so you can see how these extra sentences really are part of the whole idea, and you can't just give the quote and then move on to something else. If you don't have those sentences afterwards, the whole thing falls apart. All right, let's go look at a paraphrase. All right, here's an example of a paraphrase within text citation. In his 1963 I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King describes how he wants his own children to live in a world where they're judged based on their behaviors and achievements rather than their race. In some ways, we can see King's dream has been achieved, but in other ways, it hasn't yet. All right. You can see I put a little pink note up there at the top that said that actually Martin Luther King himself got in trouble for possible plagiarism for his PhD thesis paper. In the end, he didn't get his PhD revoked, but the questions about it tarnished his reputation a little bit, which is too bad. So let's learn about how to avoid it. Let's go to the next slide. Here are the in-text citation components, just like the previous two, the short quote and the block quote. You can see in 1963, I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King describes, and that's the setup where we give the author's name and the context, okay? Then we've got this black section, which is the paraphrase. You can see it's put in their own terms. If you're familiar with King's speech, he says, I believe all people my children should be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Okay, but the way that it's been put here is judged based on their behaviors and achievements rather than simply their race. That's a little bit different than what he actually said, but it conveys the exact same idea. Again, you can see at the end, there's the page number. So if I see a page number just appear in the middle and there's no quotation marks anywhere around it, I should know that that is a paraphrase. And if I go back a little bit before it, I should be able to see author's name and the context. Now in these green sentences here at the end, we find out why this student is using this quote, and it's to talk about the dream of racial equality and whether or not it's been achieved. I don't know what the paper's argument is exactly, but that seems to be the topic. All right, let's go to the next slide. We just looked at that paraphrase from Martin Luther King, and paraphrases may sound the easiest, but I would like you to use them as little as possible in your papers, mostly because we could incorrectly paraphrase what somebody said. So I could say, oh, Martin Luther King in his I Have a Dream speech was talking about how important he thinks it is for all Americans to be gun owners. Wait a minute. That's obviously not what he said. Paraphrases, I mean, you wouldn't make a mistake of that size, but paraphrasing really requires you to be very, very accurate, and to put it in your own words, you may be ending up plagiarizing without even meaning to, or just getting the information inaccurate. So it's best to just avoid and go with short quotes, block quotes where needed. All right, let's go to the next slide. Is there anything you need to do differently if you're writing a research paper? Yes, there is. The big thing that you do differently is that you have to explain why the person you're quoting is an expert or a scholarly source. Okay, so here's an example. Dr. Pete Broad. So if you're writing a paper for a literature class, you would do things differently. You would, if, for example, you were using poetry, you would put slashes where the line breaks are, but that's something you don't need to worry about for this class. All right, let's move on. Okay, so you think you understand how to do the in-text citations. We've talked about it a little bit before. You can check out this slide if you want to look at it more closely. Just pause it using the controls on your screen. Let's go to the next one, though. We now need to learn a bit about the works cited page. All right, there is this place called the OWL at Purdue, which is a website, and it shows you how to do the works cited page for MLA Citation. And I'm going to put a link to it for you on the website. But in the meantime, go to the next slide and take a look at a sample works cited page. All right, so here's a sample works cited page. You can see that there are, I think, 8 or so items listed on this. And for a research paper, that's typical. You might have a few more. You can see that the list runs onto if it runs onto a second or third line, that those are all indented, and that the first line actually sticks out and the second line is indented. If you're having All right, you are not going to remember exactly how to format each type of source for a works cited page. All right, what you're going to do is you're going to keep track of everything so that when you're ready, you can compile your list for the works cited page. So you're going to use this link here. It says click here. That goes to the OWL page. at Purdue, but if you can't, if that link is broken or something like that, just go to Google and put in OWL at Purdue MLA, and it will take you here. Purdue is a college, and they just happen to have a very good website for this that most people use to teach their students how to do it. And you can see the navigation panel over on the right. It's very easy to use, and it shows you the type of formatting for all the different things, and it goes back over in-text citation if you need help with that, if this presentation wasn't quite enough. All right, let's keep going. So you're saying if I go to OWL, it will show me what to do to format my works cited page? That's absolutely correct. You'll see that. Sometimes keep class links, and that always has OWL on it, and you should be able to find it from Google, like I said before. Can we review it? Sure. Let's do a quick review. MLA citation is a thing you do in scholarly writing. There are 3 different things you need to do. Well, the whole point of it is to give people credit for their ideas, support your own ideas, and avoid plagiarism. So that's why we do it. There are 2 components, in-text and works cited. In-text has 3 parts. You give the author's name, the title of publication, and the context, and for research papers, explain why that author is legitimate and scholarly. Then you give the quote in either short or block quote format, or occasionally a paraphrase, and after the quote, you explain how it relates to your thesis. You do the same thing every time. 3 steps. You avoid paraphrases because they carry a high risk for plagiarism, but you use them if you need them. Still, keep them limited. The works cited page comes at the very end of your paper. It's a separate sheet from the rest of it, and you follow just a regular format that's listed online, and I've given you the website for it to make sure that you get it right. You keep all your web and publisher information available so that you don't have to hunt for it when you need it at the end. All right, so every quote, every time, no exceptions.